Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar series, Women on the Margin, which will explore women and intersectionality in Israel. This is a part of a larger series that is going to go out through this quarter. Our next speaker will talk on February 22nd, so mark your calendar, and that will be Rawia Abu Rabia, which will talk about, her talk will be Excluded from the Law, Muslim Women in Religious Courts in Israel. Today, I have the great honor of introducing you all to Professor Pina Motzafi-Haller, which is going to talk about her work on and her book titled Concrete Boxes, Mizrahi Women on Israel's Periphery. Professor Haller, Motzafi-Haller, is a professor of anthropology from Ben-Gurion University of the Negev in Israel. She received her PhD from Brandeis University in 1988, and since 1995 has been working in Israel and on Israel topics, especially on Mizrahi women in patterns of ethnic, class, and gender inequality. The book Concrete Boxes is Mizrahi Women on Israel Periphery examines the pattern of inequality known as intersectionality experienced by Mizrahi women in the periphery. And this book has received rave reviews and also has been made into a play that has been playing around Israel and exposing large Israeli audiences to the plight of Mizrahi women in the periphery. Professor Pina Motzafi-Haller is currently a visiting professor at NYU working on a new book titled Blonde Hair, Dark Roots. And I welcome Professor Haller. I'm very excited to hear your talk today. And this webinar is also follows our class on sociology of gender, Israel as a microcosm for social trends. So we have our students with us today, as well as a larger audience, and we look forward for your talk. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you for this beautiful introduction. I'm sitting now in New York, where I'm a visiting professor, and I'm looking forward to go back to Israel. Let me tell you, kind of frame a bit the context in which the book was written and the research on which it was based. I returned from my PhD in the US in '95 to Israel. And my PhD actually dealt with African societies. I did work in Botswana. But as I wrote in another piece that was published in Hebrew and English, my main idea about becoming an anthropologist was really my desire to understand the society and my position, the Israeli society, and my position as a Mizrahi woman within that larger setting. I was very aware when I left to graduate school in '78 that I am not able to carry out research on the topic that I wanted to do because I was surrounded by a discourse that was simply modernist sociology, extremely paternalistic, and that my emotions and my sense of doing research was really going to be harmed and not really making my research possible for many reasons. And so I decided to do research in Africa. So when I went back to Israel after 17 years in the States, I was determined to go back to the topic that actually made me decide to take anthropology as my main research topic. Upon arriving in Israel, I did a research review about what was written about Mizrahi women and discovered that there was basically nothing. There was old literature from the 50s that was extremely paternalizing and was talking about our less fortunate sisters who would never get into the advanced modernist society of Israel, and nothing in the 80s and 90s. So when I wrote the research proposal and got the grants from the Israeli Academy of Science, I was proposing basically, let's study what these women are all about. And I taught in Beersheba University and lived in a campus which is really deep in the desert. It's called Sde Boker. I don't know how many of you visited Israel, but it's a gorgeous, beautiful scenery in Sde Boker. And between the campus in Beersheba and the place where I lived in Sde Boker, Yerucham was on the road. So I began to think about doing research in Yerucham, and the women who you have to begin ethnographic work by making some kind of contact in the local community. And I realized that the women who were coming to clean my office in the university were coming from Yerucham every day in a busing system. So that's how I began this research. And so the first point was there was no knowledge about these women. People assumed a lot of things about them. The framework was very outdated, and I was very keen to do what I called a feminist ethnography. And I will explain that term because what I want to emphasize, and it came out in Tamar's introduction, Israel as a microcosm, that we anthropologists do an in-depth study of one location, and not only one country, but one community, but we don't do it just because of these particular people or because we claim that they are representative of a society. We do that because we want to get insights about larger processes and to advance theoretical discussions. The first word that also was mentioned, and maybe the students of Tamar are familiar with it, is intersectionality. Let me say a few words about that because it's critical to the whole perspective of my research. When feminist scholarship came to some kind of visibility in academia in the late 70s, when I was doing my African research, right? The concept of gender and gender studies were placed in the center. And for almost a decade or longer, feminist or gender studies were really talking only about the gap or the structures or the patterns that made a difference in power and access to resources between the genders, between men and women in society. By the early 90s, there was a new, very vigorous voices from women of color and from women who were not middle class, who said that all this feminist fervor is really ignoring other patterns of inequality and exclusion from resources, and that often this axis of difference are not only along gendered line, but at the same time, they are along class, ethnicity, race, religion, sexual identities. That's the term intersectionality. So intersectionality called for a research that will look at the several intersecting axes of inequality. So in a way, I define myself not as a gender study person, but as an inequality studies scholar. So I went to Yerucham because it was a social reality that exhibited all these lines of exclusion at the same time. The women who became my interlocutor in the community that I focused on for almost 4 years, were a Mizrahi ethnicity axis, and I'll say a few words what it means to be Mizrahi in Israel. There were blue-collar workers, not even pink collars. There were cleaners, they were working in factories, and a lot of them were unemployed. They had access to very low-grade education. A local high school offered professional training, and a lot of them were trained to be hairdressers. And how many hairdressers can you have in a small community? I mean, so basically they had no education within the Israeli educational system. And the third major, or the fourth major axis of inequality was geographical. Yerucham is the name of the village where I worked is known as a development town, Ayeret Pituach. A few words about that term. Development towns were created, were engineered, were kind of communities that were planned during the early 60s, late 50s. There were some in the north. And a lot of them, not all of them, were located at the borders of the Israeli new state. And the purpose was to lay claim to land. So it was a national purpose. And nobody, of course, wanted to live in this out of center, out of employment, new villages, new towns. So the state of Israel sent the least powerful, the most disempowered population to these regions, to these development towns. So the development towns were built without decent infrastructure, without proper employment opportunities, and they became underdeveloped bodies of life rather than really development. So when I was starting my research, actually in the beginning of 2000, we're talking about almost 50 years, 40, 50 years of existence of these new locations. And they were exhibiting processes of reproduction of class and marginalization. And my big question was, if the Israeli state was a democratic state, equal state, at least for the Jewish communities, and I would not get into the Palestinian question here, within the Jewish population, there's a claim for equal access to resources, to education. It's state education. Why do we see in 2000, in the second and the third generation of immigrants from Arab countries, systematic downward mobility? They were not able to escape the pattern of blue-collar existence that reproduced itself in these towns. So the other word I would explain is the term Mizrahi. Mizrahi in Hebrew, Mizrach means east, and it's parallel to what most Americans speak about as Sephardi. Sephardi Jews are the Jews who did not come from Europe. So within Israel, two major categories and intra-Jewish categories emerge. One is known as Mizrahi, which is non-European, and the other is Ashkenazi, which is European Jews. And the pattern that had emerged, and every person who lived in Israel with open, observation would not dispute the fact that most of the Mizrahi population cluster in the lower ranks of society, while the Ashkenazis cluster in the middle and higher echelons of society. What happens with the political system is something which is very complicated. I'm talking about class position, okay, access to resources as a general trend. So development town, Mizrahi, now ethnography, a few words about what is ethnography and what do I mean by feminist ethnography. Ethnography is a research method which has been used now not only by anthropologists. I mean, we have the claim you cannot be an anthropologist if you don't do a proper ethnography. Now it's kind of becoming less severe, but ethnography meant getting your knowledge, your research knowledge, not through questionnaires and not through interviews. I mean, you could use interviews and you could use questionnaires and you could use surveys, but the major, the bulk, the heart of your research is a daily contact with the people and observation, what we call participant observation in the daily life of the people. So we claim that our data is not what people want to say and not how people are presenting themselves, but we see people in circumstances which are not accounted for, which are not designed. We see everyday life. So I started my research in Yerucham in 2000. And it meant that I would drive 20 minutes from my house in the Midrasha and go back home. After 2 years, I decided that I have enough data. I went on sabbatical to Canada, tried to write the book and decided I don't have enough. I don't really understand what's going on. It was a really difficult project. And I went back for another year. So between 2000 and 2004, I collected the data for the research. Now, feminist, and that kind of frames the whole approach to this book. Feminist research, at least in my definition, and I have a new book coming out, going to press as we speak, that speaks about towards a feminist ethnography in Israel, towards feminist ethnography in Israel, where I really lay out that philosophical and epistemological framework. And what it meant is that we are very aware about power relations within the research process itself. And we try to do everything to undermine these power relations. So here we are. I'm a Mizrahi woman who was born in a development town in the north. I speak about it in the book, in a development town called Migdal HaEmek. And I'm actually going to study my people, women. What I was struggling to articulate and to come to terms with is how these women think about their lives. How do they speak about their lives? What do they do in their lives? And not what either well-wisher leftist social scientists claim that they are downtrodden or they are victims of racism or capitalist processes. I said, yes, my starting point for the research was my colleagues in the university, in Be'er Sheva, in different departments have done a wonderful job in quantifying, in making very clear that the residents of these development towns, especially of Yerucham, which is extremely remote from the Israeli center, was really not something which commends Israeli state for equality or for dealing with this problem of marginalization. But what's next? I mean, by criticizing, you actually never hear what the people themselves say. Do they run around thinking, oh, we are really victims, and our life are horrible, and we are ugly, and we are useless, like all these good, intended journalists who land on this village will for one afternoon would write in their very angry reportage. So the challenge was to make them heard and to try not to impose my views on their perspectives. So I did several strategies of research. One of the most obvious and most kind of releasing the power of the researcher was to give, I offered it to many more women, but 2 women really went along with it, and they wrote texts. I paid them per text. It was a struggle to get my administrator to pay them. I said, they're my research assistants. What do you want? They are writing about their lives. If I would hire a student who will come and hear them out, you'd pay her, right? Now I want them to write the text. And I use this self-descriptive text in the book in 2 chapters, but I use the text in a dialogical manner with my observation and with the interaction that I had with these women. So I do not claim, as I've seen even now recently in Israel in other books, that what the native says is pure and holy, because the native knows what they say. I frame the way that the texts were formulated. I analyze situation. I depict the woman who was writing about her life. So this is one strategy of not falling into that simple pattern of I'm the researcher and you are going to speak to me and I would write and I will decipher. I would write in a academic, complicated phrases what you're telling me. And then there'll be this, you see that a lot in writing about women, they'll bring the quote of a woman who speaks in not very elaborate, not very articulate manner. And then the researcher would say what the interlocutor was saying, the interviewee was saying. So I was trying to break this notion of colonial pattern of doing research. The other element that you see a lot is that I put myself into the scene. I'm not an invisible camera. I do not speak about them, but I speak about us. In other lectures, I read segments from the book, but I think I would not do that unless you ask me later on in the question. If you want, I can read that. What it does, it enables the reader to understand how the knowledge was created. And knowledge is created in an encounter. And so in each of these chapters, I describe every situation and how I learned about that situation. So if a woman tells me about the fact that she saves the few pennies that she earns and juggles with her limited resources for her son's bar mitzvah party, for 10 years or even longer, to make sure that the party of the bar mitzvah will be beautiful and with lots of cakes and photographers, etc. I do not speak about it as, the natives do that, or the Yeruchami tend to save for a bar mitzvah. I describe how I sit in the house of this woman, and the whole process. I mean, if your student have read that, Tamar, I don't know, the whole process of how I put the tape recorder, and she gets very excited and she brings the food to the table, and then another neighbor walks in and she tells her life story, and I expose my questions that are not just these pristine scientific objective questions. I ask out of my own middle class thinking, for example, but why? Why did you make such a big party? Everybody knows that you have very little money. And then she says to me, what do you mean? What do you mean why? This is how I wanted to do it. And so this whole encounter exposes the different class position. It makes me vulnerable because I'm not the scientist who knows all, and she's not the subject who is just giving me the information that I want. And it also makes the whole reading of such report, I think, more countable. It makes you realize this is how she came to conclude what she concluded. And I even do another step of bringing the text of the book before it was published to my students and the Israeli students, and they commented on it. So the students will say, I don't agree with you. I think this woman is lazy. I think what she's doing is this and that. You know, so the situation opens discussion. The situation exposes vulnerability. The situation, the depiction is engaging, and I hope, and I worked very hard on it, which nobody gives you credit in academia. In academia, they just give you credit about the number of publication in, you know, forgotten articles that you published anywhere, somewhere. I hope it was an evocative kind of reading. And I do that not because I have a ego of a writer, which I'm now developing, which is another subject. I'm proud of writing well. I'm proud of writing in a way that will get the reader interested in what I'm doing. But I also want my book to be read beyond academia. And this is my sense of social transformation. This is my sense, and I want my book to be read by the children and the nephews and the sisters of the women and the women themselves that I'm writing about, okay? So these elements of what I define, reflexivity, evocative writing, being aware of power relations within the research are critical to what I call feminist ethnography. Now, I think that's enough in terms of the framing. Let's delve into the book itself. The book is, after an introduction, which is extremely short. I mean, it was the longest it took me to write was this 17-page or whatever introduction. But I think that people who are interested should just put away my introduction and delve into the stories. And there are 5 stories, 5 different women. And the importance is that it's not that I knew, of course, only 5 women. I knew many more. The choice of the 5 stories was made because I wanted to trace 5 different structural paths of dealing with what I call the concrete box. And the concrete box is that multiple marginalization that define their lives, right? The idea is that it's not just the glass ceiling in the famous feminist discourse that women are trying to break the glass ceiling. I'm saying that these women are surrounded. It's not only ceiling, it's a box, and it's not clear glass, it's really cement, concrete. box. So how do they deal with it? That is the main question. And what I decided to do was to trace 5 different paths. One path was getting, how do you say that? In the States, you speak about Chazara b'tshuva is getting stronger in your religiosity. It's like reclaiming your religiosity. So one of the women, Efrat, in the book, I trace her and her family, her 5 daughters, and their path to returning and becoming more strict in their Jewish religiosity. And my analysis actually shows that, which is a really controversial conclusion that this research ended up with. I remember I had a religious journalist from Makor Rishon, the newspaper of the Zionist religious group, coming to me and said, "But you're secular. How come you came with this conclusion?" And my conclusion, which is rather startling, and I'll say it now and then go to the other path, is that the upward mobility, the best path was through this path of becoming stronger in your religiosity, not through the liberal view that we should get more kids in high school to pass the matriculation exam so they'll get into college and they'll be upwardly mobile there. I'm questioning this whole trajectory. And towards the end of that chapter, I compare between 2 sisters, one who is becoming strong in religion and the one who is not, and they both come from the same family, they both have the same formal education, and the one who is becoming stronger in her religiosity is able to secure a job as a kindergarten teacher, while her sister is only the cook or the cleaner. So this is kind of like the pattern of this one path. The other 3 paths, the first one is this woman who is really the kind of quintessential welfare woman. Her former husband was a drug addict, and she's juggling all these welfare payments and jobs that she does under the radar. And she's the one who is saving all this money for her son's bar mitzvah. And what I'm making explicit is how I had real difficult time understanding her, and how I learned through this long process to really realize how much resources and emotional power she has to make a home for her 2 children. So there's a lot of internal contradictions in each of these stories. It's not like the perfect, the poor, wonderful mother, the big mama who is like so brave, etc. The other woman is the woman who is like, I call her the smiling representative of Yerucham. She can speak the language of the middle class, and she is jumping on 2 discourses. It's really interesting to listen to her. The one who is the rebel, who is my favorite girl, she refuses to get married. She refuses to have children. She botches every job she has. And my view of her is that she is the best analyst of the situation. And she said, if it's so against me, I'm just going to have fun. And I'm not going to try to buy into the model of the good worker and good mother. And the final one was very interesting. She was a good friend of mine. She was what I call the success story. She went to a boarding school, like myself, out of the development town. And she got a degree and she became a school principal. And I depict her very conflictual feeling about the town, her hometown. And her story is actually structurally a very interesting analysis of what happened when the few who manage to bridge, to jump, jump, the social mobility and end up in middle class, but they are not, the community loses them. They never go back. They never build the community from which they sprang out of. So the whole idea about solving or making Yerucham or other development towns develop is critically not by having upwardly mobile people, because upwardly mobile people do not go back to this godforsaken place. They have nothing to do there. So in each of these lines, I actually think through major questions about social mobility, about the way we as individuals deal with larger social structures and processes, about what does it mean to do non-colonial research? Because as you know, anthropology, is hated in Africa. It's like the colonial way of knowledge. We can do anthropology, which is not necessarily in that way. I think I'll stop here.
So thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. And indeed, the book is just captivating. The writing is captivated. I can testify as a reader. And I think you really reconstruct the way in which your conversations with your interlocutors, the scenes itself, and how power relations are also manifested within the realm that you're operating with your So I think for that, it's a wonderful reading. I wanted to ask you first, if you could elaborate a little bit more about the Mizrahim, because you explained that that Mizrahim were settled in these development towns because they were the least powerful. But could you explain what that means? Why are they the least powerful? Is there also discrimination that is continuous against them? Do they suffer from any other intersections that marginalize them and the Mizrahi women?
Okay, I did edit a book in 98 called Mizrahim in Israel. I think it's only in Hebrew. And that's where we really treated the whole question about to what extent the social structure of Israel is structurally limiting the ability of Mizrahim to enter into Israeli society. There's also fantastic studies by Aziza Kazum. I don't know if you know about her work, by Yuda Shinhav and others. This is the larger processes. The development towns were really kind of the extreme case of active marginalization. They were created in an era where the policy was from the boat to the community. So people would say, and it's recorded again and again, that they would, people from Morocco will come, into the Israeli airport or with boats, and they would say to the bureaucrat there, "Oh, we want to go to Jerusalem," and he says, "Sure, you go into that truck." And then they'll take them in the middle of the night, and then they'll literally drop them into this place that had nothing in it, few caravans, few horrible little makeshift kind they basically built this location from nothing. And so that was designed. They would not send Ashkenazi people some of the Romanians who were illiterate, although they were Europeans, would be sent with the Moroccans. In Yeruham, there is a population of Romanian and Moroccan, and they eventually kind of were able to extricate themselves. The Mizrahi were not able to escape. And they would, even if they were middle class and upwardly mobile in their countries of origin, like I'm writing in this new book about my own family, about my parents in Iraq who were middle class and looking up, and how they lost all their resources and all their savings through this kind of living in the 50s in that situation. So the development towns are really, it's not a hidden process of exclusion. It's basically you take these people and put them as far as possible where they have no access to resources. So that's a thing. Oh, there's also a small community of Indian people from India, Jews from India in Yeruham. So the whole categories of Mizrahi and Ashkenazi is very fluid, and it's actually a local, it's Israeli created social categories. The other thing is, what I'm saying is that the question that I posed is that how does it reproduce itself? Okay, so people in Israel would tell you, okay, that was in the 50s. You know, they were horrible. They did terrible things. Yes, you're right. But today, everything is okay. And I'm saying, how could it be okay if Yeruham still stands in the lowest socioeconomic rank? And that's a big question. Why, in what way does the Israeli state recreate this socio class, this ethnic class, you know? And how do people deal with that? That's it.
And that actually really taps into one of the questions one of our students has raised, which is talking about these reproduction. A question comes of what can Israel do to improve the quality of the life of women living in the country's periphery? And once the communities are elevated, how long do you think it will take for cities like Yeruham to be seen by Israelis in a more positive light, rather than the traditional kind of marginality associated with such cities?
Your student is about 18 or something? It's like I gave a lot of lectures to Israelis who are like in training for the army and these young people. And when they hear me, they want to leap for the end to the solution. Here is the good willing thing person saying, okay. So I'm convinced it's bad. So how do we solve it? And when do we reach the solution? Well, it's not, life does not work like that. And if I had the magic key, the magic solution, it would be great. But academics don't change, you know, the world in this way. The only thing we hope to do is to depict the processes in more nuanced manner. I do not have a solution. What I say is that let's think about policies that had existed. So one of the most challenging conclusion from my analysis is that pouring resources into schools and I do have an interview in this one young woman in the book who is telling me she is in a special class that they give them extra private lessons so they would pass the matriculation exam. And I said, oh, so you are really, you know, excited about doing this and studying? And she said, yes, I want to study. But when I keep with her, you see, that's the whole point. The point is not to know better what's good for them, as if they were kids and I'm telling you, okay, if you do this, you stop being poor, okay? We'll solve your situation. The young woman told me, but you know, there are this friend of hers who got the matriculation exams and they actually live in Tel Aviv And that's a big thing of escaping from Yeruham. But they tell her that, their life is not improved because they are like waitresses and they are like service position in Tel Aviv, and that she actually finds comfort and homeliness in her town. She knows everybody, her family is there. So I'm raising questions. I'm opening for discussion. I don't have a solution. I'm just questioning the idea that if you just pour money into these development towns, then everybody will get matriculation and goes to college and becomes middle class, when I'm talking about the success of this fifth woman that I'm depicting in the book. So what I'm doing is opening questions, challenging wisdom. For example, the idea that, these Mizrahi people who take their kids out of the mainstream education and study in this kollel, in these religious schools, they're actually doing terrible things because their kids are just studying Torah and they would never be lawyers or doctors. And I'm presenting the story of this woman who is the daughter of one of the religious, the main character that I'm tracing. And she's saying, what do you think? We can be doctors, we can be this? No, it's better that my son will have self-respect. And, because the options of middle class, the idea of automatic mobility is not something which is part of their horizon. So in her choice, her son being herself opting to dress in a modest way rather than in the sexually attractive way that women of her class dress, is something which gives her access to more resources than others. So there's all these questions that I'm opening, and it's not the smart people with the education who knows the solution and tell us what to do. It's listen to the complexity of what the people themselves are talking. Okay, so it's like, the purpose of writing a book like that is to open up questions, to open discussion. And you mentioned that it was made into a play, and then what they did is they had the characters, and I was one of the characters, right? The anthropologist was one of the 5 characters, and then when the play was over, the actors would come and have a discussion with it has to start thinking in new ways about this complex issue of mobility. So it might not satisfy the person who asked the question, because it's, okay, tell us what to do and we'll do it, because we feel guilty. We are the college students and they are not. How do we solve it? We want to, it doesn't work like that.
Thank you. Another thing that you raised, and you raised also in this talk and the book, is how religious becomes a path for upward mobility. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, the illustration is really kind of makes you understand what I'm saying without abstraction. I trace these 2 sisters. The one that I call Efrat, with her 5 daughters, is going through the process of becoming more religious. She comes from a Moroccan family. Her family keep Shabbat. They are what is known as Masorti, as traditionalists. But when she grows up, she becomes secular. She dresses up in particular way. She goes to parties. She does not define herself as a religious person. After she gets married, when she has a hard time conceiving or something, she has a dream, and in her dream, her uncle comes, whatever have you, that triggers a process of her becoming more and more religious. She started attending classes that are offered in the community, which I attended. I attended every class about religiosity. And she changes the way she dresses, and she stopped watching TV, and she moves in the world with a sense of self-respect. And when a position is open in the community where I live, in Sde Boker, and they're looking for a childcare personnel for the pre-kindergarten class, she's considered. She has a background, although she never went to college. She had 10 years of education. As she's going through the interview, her sister comes out of the room, and she is heavy smoker. Her hair is bleached. She wears this kind of outfit of a lower class woman. And I watch these two sisters, and I realize that the middle class women who hired, my friends, who hire Efrat as a kindergarten teacher and her sister as the cleaner and the cook, are aware of the cultural capital that Efrat brings.
So that she gets a form of social respectability from her.
Exactly. I talk a lot by Beverly Skeggs, the British sociologist, speaks about respectability. Her work is really influential on my work. She talks about women in England and the pink color and the blue color, and they're not. She mainly talk about like nurses, not certified nurses, and the whole notion of respectability is very important. So the path to social mobility, which is there, she's not going to be a lawyer. She's not going to be
right. They have
CEO.
Their own constraints that are
right. She, within her life, she actually channels her resources in a constructive manner. And so
say that she is channeling through within the concrete box.
Yes, that's the whole point. Because I said the people who escape the concrete box don't go back to the village. And if they do, as my friend, the successful one, she says, I cannot stand it. I walk through these streets and I see this person who is begging you to give me 5 shekel. And I realized, my God, he was this young, wonderful man when I knew him in high school. How did he become this horrible beggar? So she has a very conflictual relationship to her community. But if you stay there and you want to create a cohesive family, if you want to get a job, if you want to live a life of self-respect, because a lot of the thing about the lower classes is that's what I'm working in this new book, is the lack of self-respect, is the sense of trying to deal with a gaze that looks down at you,
Thank you. We only have a few more minutes left. I just wanted to mention that the book is available on Amazon. We will try to link it later. Some people asked for if people want to purchase it. I got many questions. We got many questions from the audience concerning your positionality in the field. You having your background as a Mizrahi woman from a development town in the north, and how did you think that affected your relationship with your interlocutors, and whether or not, if if you think that had an effect on gaining you access, or how did that impact your access?
Okay, that's a very important question. The question of positionality is something that I speak a lot in my introduction to anthropology classes. Everybody is positioned. We're doing social research. So if you are a white male, non-Israeli, if you influence the field in a particular way. If you are, whatever, class or social background. When I was doing research in Africa, the little kids would run after me and shout, "Lechoa, Lechoa, the white woman, the white woman." I'm writing about this in one of my articles, how I was white in one session and a schwarze, a black in another session. What does it mean? All research is defined by who we are and the encounter that we create with the people. There is no, in one of the articles I speak about, there's nothing that makes you better researcher if you're a native researcher. There's some elements which opens up to you and some which don't. But if all research is written by men and they don't have access to women, it begs a question about, who is the researcher, right? But the positionality is something we should all make explicit and analyze. Make it up in our awareness as we do the research and while we write the research results. There is no objective position. There is no position which doesn't influence the interlocutors. Every position is, by definition, position,
And did you have conversations with your interlocutors about the fact that you share a similar background? Did that affect?
Oh yeah, I write about it. Like at one point, I remember there was this Ashkenazi woman who became Leah Shakdiel, who became very famous in Israel because she challenged the religious court and entered as a woman, the first woman to enter religious councils, which was barred before that. And so I would talk to her and people would see us. And then one man in Yerucham looked at me and said, "Are you the cousin of Leah Shakdiel?" And I was like, "Are you kidding me?" I mean, Leah is like with their religious Zionist hat, and she's very Ashkenazi. And I said to him, "I'm the cousin?" And then I realized that he doesn't think about me as Mizrahi because he doesn't associate middle class with Mizrahi. You understand the point?
Yeah, of course.
And so when I went to buy scones in a local bakery, the guy would say, "Oh, are you a new teacher in school?" Because they really were aware of the way I talk, the way I interact is not one of them, although I come from the same background, right? Yes. So rather than hiding or playing, kind of diminishing the idea, "Oh, I'm a Mizrahi woman, I'm holier than thou, you're the white woman, you cannot do the research I do," I don't believe that. I believe that you would have a different reaction, I would have a different reaction. The way we deal with it, the way we analyze it, this is what makes good research or not good research. So there's this whole idea about diversity as a holy grail in America is a bit too extended. Now, nobody is going to fire me for any university here for saying that. Research is done by people, and people can do bad research or not bad research. Every position should be accounted for and revealed and discussed and become sensitive, of course. You can't just treat people like nothing and say, "Well, that's it. I'm the superior white person, so deal with it."
Join me in thanking Pnina for Professor Motzafi-Haller for joining us and for sharing her research and her more personal account of this really fascinating research. Thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.